direction. The world is changing right now in front of our eyes, and the choices that we're making right now are going to collectively and individually prescribe what our future looks like. And our actions are either going to place us in a place where we've had to exchange our commitment for justice and equity for resignation and more and more and more suffering, or we're going to tell the stories and do the engagement and engage in action that's going to actually reorient all of us so that we are centering the voices, the vision, and the leadership from Black and Latinx and Indigenous communities, from women, from folks who have been relegated to poverty. That is our charge here, to, like Kat said, bring in new voices, create space for new people to be in charge of their own destiny, and the choice is up to us. And so I think this is a great start to the conversations. I'm looking forward to seeing you all next time and time after that. And here you go, Harold.
Hey, good afternoon. I want to thank you, Kat, and your entire team for your commitment to having this conversation, especially during this time of the pandemic, now that we see who's essential, non-essential, and learning more and more about why for 2-3 decades, those that have been fighting environmental justice, social justice, economic justice, have talked about these impacts that this pandemic is basically pulled the covers back and have shown how we have not invested in these communities. And many of these communities with weakened immune systems that I'm about to show you is why this pandemic is wreaking so much and impacting African American and Black and Brown communities. So the foundation of the story I'm about to share with you is a mirror image of impacted vulnerable communities that have faced environmental, economic, and social justice injustices throughout the country. This is typical across the country. The difference is the end result here and my journey. And what I want to do is be able to show you pictures speak louder than words. And so what I would like to do is compact over this next couple of minutes to pack in 22 years of work in this community in these slides and this presentation, and let you see why so many communities feel betrayed, lack of trust, and the fight that so many have and don't want to sit at the table. You'll see this as we journey through this Regenesis story. So I want to start because a lot of times people don't understand how I got involved. And see, it was in 1993, I started passing blood, throwing up blood. My left side was swollen. I had lost a tremendous amount of weight. Doctors couldn't determine exactly what was going on with me, never diagnosed the problem. And for months, I was incapacitated, having to kneel on the side of the bed in order to go to sleep because I couldn't lay on my back and I couldn't lay on my stomach because of that pain. And it was during that time that I was able to listen to a message from Bishop T.D. Jakes. He was ministering on stewardship, and he talked about Genesis 1:23 and how mankind had dropped the ball on the responsibilities. And if we could go back and regenerate the moment. And it was at that point, the message was stewardship. When he said, if we could go back and regenerate the moment, that's where the name Regenesis came from. And it was only until about 7 years later in a community meeting when we pulled together to find out what we were going to call ourselves is where this actually, took off. But after that night of listening to Bishop Jakes, the following morning, I was out on the front porch where I could finally get up, and staring across the street at this fertilizer plant is where I remembered from the message when Bishop Jakes said, start at your own front door. If you want to create change, start where you're at your own front door. And I looked across the street at this fertilizer plant for the first time with a different lens. And it's like, here's my chance and opportunity to make a difference. And so I called the local environmental agency and set up an appointment to talk about the conditions, because kids were going in and out of that facility. Growing up, it's a dead end street. My mom would often on Sunday mornings go out and wrap a blanket around women that were sexually assaulted and dropped off there at this facility. So I looked and I thought about all those things. And as I made the appointment, I went there to the DEC office. And when I got there to the office, the young lady, it was a new receptionist that gave me the files, thought I was coming in to review the Freedom of Information, the FOIA. And at that time, I thought FOIA was a person. So I tried to pretend like I knew what I was doing. And she had this stack of files and said, would you like to review? And I looked at it. And as I signed off on this, I saw that no one else had ever, looked at these files before. I was the first signature from a site that was opened up in the 1930s until 1986, the first person to actually look at this site. And so when I did opening and going in and looking at the, what I saw in the files, I saw this hazardous waste, toxic waste, and it was like peeling an onion. Every time I, went through a document, I began to wonder if this was what was making me sick. And so as I began to look, and this is where I'm going to start to show you those pictures there of this site. And this is the front door of our house. We were considered part of the footprint of this fertilizer plant. And in the backyard, I could look at the landfill that was in the backyard. But right here at the front is where 1986, the place was shut down. And this is a photo in 1998. And you'll see going through here, everything that I read about the clean closure was definitely not clean. In this facility, there were 48 tons of superphosphate fertilizer that was left there. Timothy McVeigh only used a couple of drums to blow up the Oklahoma City. This facility was a wood structure, 6 acres, 5 stories tall. And all of this was left in this facility. The structure itself, there was no fire hydrants there for any fire protection. The nearest fire hydrant was across the tracks where there are 22 trains that run across that track per day. So being able to put that fire out was going to be a problem. This was, as I was looking through the files, saw in there that there was an acid pond of about 1.2 million gallons of acid that was trenched from a tributary to basically wash the pond into Fair Forest Creek that ran into our state park, about 4 miles from our state park where there's public fishing and swimming. No fines whatsoever. This is a photo where they made their sulfuric acid at the site. The sulfur that was left there, our state environmental agency told the owner to remove it to a proper subtitle C and D landfill. Well, what they did, they dumped it over the back fence of the property. And luckily, the deer tracks that you can see there and how the sulfur had burned out that area, luckily for the deer track, that drew attention to a lot of the environmental folks. They didn't think about the people. It was luckily the deer. But you see that little pile of sulfur, they came in with a huge excavator to remove that little pile of sulfur. And it made me wonder what was going on. Under that pile of sulfur was 20 tons of sulfur, and under the 20 tons of sulfur was the acid plant there to the right. Now, in all of this, during this investigation and beginning to find things, there was this illegal demolition that took place because many of the folks that had begun to pull together in the community that worked at this site knew a lot about what was going on at this particular site. So they imploded the building without a permit, no fines, nothing took place. They just imploded this, hoping that, as some of the other sites would not be able to get in and have a full investigation on this site. Now, here's the 20 tons of sulfur with the local fire chief who had no idea of the materials that were inside that facility. Because see, his department is a volunteer department with a 20-minute response time with 2 trucks and 1 that you could outrun. Next to the fertilizer plant was the landfill where, according to the state, it didn't exist. This landfill was owned and operated by the city of Spartanburg, but it was located jurisdictionally in the county of Spartanburg. So as you can see, the trees couldn't root because of the garbage there. And then the first test pit that EPA opened up was a test pit full of hypodermic needles. Now, not my words, but in the repository at the library right now, there's a section in there where it shows in the investigation where the lady and the man who drove the barrels out to the landfill, one morning they actually looked in the barrel, and in that barrel, that's where they saw the fetuses and amputated limbs that was dumped there. Now, this is 100 feet from the backyards of the people where they had their well water. Because during this time, even when EPA came in early 2000, folks were still on well water. So everything that was tested in that landfill was actually in their drinking water. So at that time, I had organized the 3 neighborhoods surrounding the facility. You know, there was a low-income African-American community that worked at the fertilizer plant. Then there was a predominantly white low-income mill village, and the folks across the track on the opposite side of the plant. I pulled all of them together to create Regenesis because I didn't want the words from our state environmental agency, which I had found from other folks, that how you would have one conversation with one group, another conversation with another, and all of a sudden, you know, everything is, you've got different information that people have. So pulling all of the folks together, at the beginning, there was an investigator with EPA who came in and told me the squeaky wheel gets the oil. And so during that same time, when he went back after looking at the site, when Cynthia Purifoy came in, because it was at that time my father actually started with the same problems I was having, and he actually was diagnosed with the lymphoma and the cancer, and he died New Year's Day, 1997. And it was at that time when Cynthia Purifoy, working at EPA, told me that this site was an operational textile storage warehouse. And I told her, no, this place was shut down in 1986. And she argued with me. And after my father's death, she came to Spartanburg and actually saw this site. And when he pulled up going to another site, her and the investigator said, you know, what in the world is this? And I was like, that's that operational textile storage warehouse you mentioned. And so they walked in, and immediately walking in, it's like, we should not have been able to do that. We should not have been able to gain access into this facility like this. And I'm like, that's what I've been trying to tell you. Kids go in and out playing in this thing. So that investigation sped up, and one of the workers came back and actually reported to the state agency that there was nothing wrong, nothing there. He recommended no further action, and I was making something out of nothing. Well, I actually got a chance to walk around him as he was characterizing the site, and he allowed me to videotape him taking 4 samples with 3 spoons. And I'm not a genius or a chemist, but I knew about cross-contamination. And he knelt down and did all this sampling and came back and gave this report to the media that I was blowing something out of proportion. So at that time, my center that I played football with in high school was the chief of staff for Senator Hollings, and I wrote him a letter, a quick, short letter of what was going on. Senator Hollings ordered the investigation of the site. There were 72 contaminants detected. 35 of those contaminants were 5 times above the maximum contamination level, and that's when things started to move at that point. Then we began to have meetings with the community, because expectations were that now that there's something wrong here, we want to see how fast this is going to be removed. And in talking with Ms. Purifoy and others at EPA, this is going to be a long process. So we wanted to keep the people engaged, involved in this process. And Senator Hollings told me, it's like, look, you've got everybody's attention. What do you want to do now? And it was at that point, you know, my motive, and because I had those on and off days where I could one day move, the next day I couldn't because of my side, we started looking at Brownsville's revitalization efforts and things that have taken place in other parts of the country. But in this meeting and meetings before this is when we really started to learn the impact of that site. There were 3 women in the community meeting. One stood up and said, my doctor told me I'm 1 out of 200 people that would have this rare respiratory problem where her nose was disfigured. Another lady stood up and said, no, my doctor told me the same thing. And she was literally diagonally across the street from this lady. And next door to her, another. So you had three people in a stone's throw of each other talking about what their doctors had told them. And see, during that time, I was, investigating myself, looking at a lot of the materials and everything there at the site. And I never believed my parents when they told me about my sister's death. And I took the documents and I went to a corner at the nearby coroner's office. And he told me that, she died of sepsis omphalitis. It's a germ poisoning. And right in front of the facility is where the raw materials area was located. And so when I looked at that, then I remembered my mom's sister's daughter, she died the exact same way. 2 doors down, there was another kid that died the exact same way. And then I started to look at the fact that everybody on that street died of cancer. No one died of natural causes. And I began to look parallel the street behind me. It was the exact same thing. I saw the cancer cluster. I didn't go out pointing the finger and telling anybody because I couldn't believe what I had actually found and stumbled into. At that point, with mobilizing the folks in the community, we were able to approach City Council. And this is the first time that City Council had ever heard that they were the owner, operator, and transporter of this landfill that's located in the county. So once I presented this and we galvanized and pulled the folks together, that was their first time coming in a joint effort like that. And we sat down, showed 4 slides, and that's when council admitted that this is our landfill, and they appointed a representative to work with me. And after that, we were able to do the exact same thing at the county, at Spartanburg County. And Spartanburg County assigned a representative with me. And at the Spartanburg County, we were able to get a referendum to build a new fire station and to put the resources and training for the firefighters in protecting that district. Now, at that point, people began to see that if we just mobilize and show up, the impact that you would have. And being that the people on council, not seeing me there by myself, but they saw that we packed that chamber. That was the first time they ever saw that many African Americans in one council setting. And I had the inside, outside. We had our picket signs standing on the outside. And so folks got, really, rejuvenated, knowing how if you could just come together with one voice, what we could start to make happen. And so at that point, looking at the silos that people often look at environmental justice and how do you holistically rebuild communities, you have the silo for health and social, economic, and the environment. But when you rebuild these communities, environmental justice is at the center point. It's kind of what we're seeing now with this COVID pandemic. It's front and center. Now, with our board, we were able to start looking at this whole piece of the issues. And, environmentally, we knew that we needed to clean these sites up. Health, we knew that there was a medically underserved community, no access to health care. The crime, that whole piece with crime, these abandoned facilities are incubators for drug activity because it's almost impossible for the police to patrol. The housing, those that are homeowners left because of the crime. And then all of a sudden you've got a recipe for disaster. And this is what we saw here in the community. This is an illustration of that in the Mill Village, that here are 29 mill homes, and I'm standing right behind what was the recreational facility. Kids would walk up and down that sidewalk, but that third house to the left looks kind of white there. Was a big drug house that they would shoot back and forth across the street from the other house. You would see the AK-47 shells. Here are kids walking up and down from the Arkwright community to that recreational center. Here's a condition of the house right in front of the landfill in Arkwright. When EPA went out to test this trailer, because she was still on her well water, they opened the cabinet and there was a huge black snake looking like an anaconda. Now, we had a lot of rats in the landfill and the snakes fed off the rats, and you could see that underpinning there that these snakes were getting in and out of houses in that community. And because of the railroad access right up the street to the left of the picture, there was another house that the fire department couldn't get in because of the train on the track. By the time they got there, the woman and her kids were charred to the cows and had burned up. Now, this is where after, the movement of EPA and DHEC looking at the sites and knowing that that was going to be a long process, wanted to start visioning with the residents and look at what we can try to bring back, because urban renewal had wiped away 75 Black-owned businesses on the South Side. But when you line up all the brownfield Superfund sites, they were contiguous of just about the exact 3 miles of what we lost in our downtown. And at that point, because we were having monthly meetings with DHEC, EPA, and the city and the county, those folks that were appointed to us, we created an MOU with our local government. Our county government actually became the administrator of grants, because what we see with a lot of communities, you're inundated with these small grants and you have to take all your focus in managing a grant. So what the county did, they actually said, Harold, you can identify the resources, you do that, this is what we'll do. And we began to look at how we can work together in this process of the visioning. And in that, that's where, we looked at the 8 elements, the environmental cleanup, the transportation because of no access, the poor housing conditions, no economic development, no healthcare, and the crime with public safety. So when I was going to a lot of the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council meetings, I would sit in those meetings and I would hear people testify from 4 till 11:30 at night and pointing the finger at EPA. And it was at that point President Clinton had signed the executive order on environmental justice. And I began to go to some of those other agencies and listen to what was going on. And that's when I realized that the resources were in these other agencies. It wasn't at EPA. EPA can't do anything about healthcare as far as providing that, or transportation and housing. So I began to look at that. And that's when we were designated as one of the demonstration projects for the Federal Interagency Working Group, because we were starting to work with several different agencies. And it was at that point that we applied for the $20,000 small grant to build our coalition and build a structure for the organization. We created a community health center board, a board that dealt with the economic development. And at that time, back in 1998, I incorporated the Institute, because folks were starting to ask, how did you do what you were able to do? And this is where inviting at that time, because we had Congressman Clyburn, who was new in Congress at that time, and Senator Hollings and Senator Thurmond, I invited the White House, Al Gore's Livable Communities Initiative. I copied that whole theme and invited them in. And so they actually came when EPA brought in the South African delegation to look at the same problems of environmental justice that they were dealing with there in South Africa. And it was there that one of the delegates began to look at the chemical plant in the community, because we were focused on the landfill and the fertilizer plant. And this chemical plant that you see right here, at the bottom of that screen, you can see the fence line of the neighbors. And at the top was the landfill. And at that top, all of their ethylene oxide tanks were stored next to the landfill, because they didn't know the landfill existed. So if one of those tanks blew, it would have wiped out the entire community. And plus you've got the fertilizer plant at the top, because that top part of the picture is our backyard. So this is what we call the devil's triangle, because any one of those elements had, would have caused a catastrophic problem within that community. But it was this facility and, being located there, the way they got located in the community was that there was no zoning. This was supposed to have been an apartment complex, but because of no zoning, they were able to, when there was an explosion on one side of town, they ended up storing their chemicals here, and it grew from a permitting into this facility, which was called Rhodia at that time, which is now Solvay today. But in this whole thing with the fertilizer plant and having a lot of folks to come in who you're looking for experts to speak on your behalf and help you, we got in trouble because folks began to shift the attention of what we wanted and created this huge lawsuit with the fertilizer plant. And in that lawsuit, we lost, because this was not the Aaron Brockovich story that folks thought we were going to get at the end of this rainbow, the pot of gold. And what we saw in that lawsuit was that there were, the technicians and the scientists, like a pissing contest, the scientists protecting the company, and then the scientists trying to prove the points that what we have. And so nothing happened. And, you know, that lawsuit was settled. So when we went into this whole discussion with the chemical plant, at that time was introduced to this concept called alternative dispute resolutions. The problem with that, you have to have the right facilitator. And at that time, Tim Fields had retired from EPA. And so he became our facilitator. And we had this dialogue that we sat down with this chemical company that folks hated. They wanted them out, and the chemical plant said, we're not going anywhere. Actually, the manager said, you stay on your side of the fence and we'll stay on our side of the fence. But during this whole dialogue discussion, we began to sit, talk, and map out things that became a model for the American Chemistry Council and the National Manufacturers Alliance. Because if they're not going and we're not going, how do we coexist? And that's where our facilitator was able to help us. We ended up creating this emergency preparedness concept, that there was a train derailment in South Carolina, in Aiken, South Carolina, a chlorine spill. And so we tried to do a simulation in Spartanburg with this company. Well, I was the tractor trailer driver where we had a CSX train that ran through the community, and it was supposed to have hit the tractor trailer. It went out on the EMS, and you know, the community knew what was going on, but folks in Spartanburg didn't. So folks thought that there was a real explosion that had taken place in the community. I died 7 times because the fire department was not equipped to deal with the fire there. And the folks at the chemical plant, as well as the residents, saw that if something had happened, we would have ended up like the disaster down in Aiken. And so there was a lot by sitting down in this dialogue discussion, which took place here, actually worked for us. And we got more, actually what the people wanted in the lawsuit, we were starting to get with this chemical company. So we went back to the fertilizer plant and began to devise a plan, because the people wanted the facility down. The lawsuit was over, the plant was still there. And so it was up to us. And at that point, we devised a deconstruction plan, which looked like a Ringling Brothers tent. It went over this facility and deconstructed it. They dug moats around it to make sure, as they're wetting the facility, as they're deconstructing it, nothing went off site. We put up air monitors around to make sure that there was no other particulates that got into the community. And so this is the result here today with that site gone. And at that point, in August of 2000, a couple of months after the South Africans and Keith Laughlin from the White House was in Spartanburg, I put together with EPA this Building Livable Communities Forum, to where we were able to bring in the federal agencies to start addressing the elements that we had addressed, that we wanted to look at the grant and grant opportunities. So we had this big meeting. They came in, they told us what grant opportunities were there. Folks were shocked that we were able to draw those federal agencies into Spartanburg. So this big meeting was a success, but you know, oftentimes, every time when you have a meeting, folks walk away and that's it. What I decided was, we wanted to roll up the sleeves the next month and bring everybody back. And that's where we began to develop the goals and strategies. And we looked at how our goals lined up with the local government, the city and the county, the community and the federal agencies. And so we tied all of this together and began applying for different grants. That's where a year after that, we received about 3 or 4 EPA grants. And then we got our weed and seed grant from the Justice Department. And this is where, too, it's important to work with other groups and networks, to where you can talk and look at, you know, what is actually working in other parts. I found out from Richard Moore in New Mexico, from down in Dallas, this weed and seed was a disaster. So we made sure when we prepared our weed and seed grant that it was done in the right way. The only thing about the weed and seed grant, they talked about all the crime on the South Side, which didn't allow us to build anything or attract anything in. When we wrote this grant and did the assessment, at first they said we didn't have enough crime. So I had to go back and borrow some crime. I gerrymandered a couple of more public housing complexes nearby to actually qualify for that particular grant. And then we went after the federally qualified health center grant. That's where I saw the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry would always go out and look at sites and say that the contamination stops at the fence line. So I didn't want them coming into our community writing an assessment on these sites because we knew the impact that we had. And at the NEJAC meeting, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council that 45 is trying to get rid of, well, at that meeting, it was important. And I found that the Thurgood Marshall Law School had students at Texas Southern that they actually came in, did our health assessment. That data that was collected from an HBCU got us the top grant award that Senator Hollings had secured funding for federally qualified health centers and said something had better come into South Carolina. So that's when we applied for it and we got that grant. And it was at that time, the Bush administration, we created another forum to keep people engaged, the stakeholders. And this is where the Bush administration sent in then acting administrator Marianne Harenko and Jimmy Palmer, and when Tim Fields was still at EPA, came in, and we had this meeting right before our dedication of the Community Health Center. And this is where the Community Health Center, once we received and got the grant, the funny thing about it, this is where you have to be careful about folks that are on your board and call themselves, with you, because once you start the success, things tend to happen and go awry. And so this is why it's important at the very beginning with your community assessment, your goals, your vision, not to have anybody to come in and create another vision of division. This is where this was important, because once we received the grant, the person that was on our board tried to take our grant to subsidize it for the local health department. And when we decided and said, no, that's not going to happen, that's not what we told the community we were going to do, we lost all the real estate in Spartanburg. And it was at that point, I hooked up with another historically Black college, Howard University, and the students came down and helped convert this building that we got into, because we had 160 days to get operational or we would lose the grant or have to give it to the health department. And so we were able to do that, and we got into this facility, and I named it after Senator Hollings because I kind of felt, well, maybe with the senator's name, they won't beat me up so bad. And so we did this, got it open, and then right after that, about a year and a half later, the local hospital system saw that this federally qualified health center was actually key and a safety net to the hospital system of keeping people out the emergency room. This is where they saw that giving folks a medical home to deal with these diseases was important. And so this is where we went from, 4 or 5 exam rooms to 15 to 18 exam rooms. And then we expanded, because of the increase of growth here in Spartanburg, we ended up with this facility, and we have now 8 facilities in 3 different counties. And the services that we provide for that impoverished population and creating a medical home, we have our agricultural farm worker program, school-based health initiative, with our kids for behavioral health. And the biggest thing with federally qualified health centers is that the 340B pharmacy program discounts prescription drugs at 50%. So that population that we're serving, low income, that are deciding whether to pay their utility bills or to get their prescriptions, is key. And that's where right now it's even more important to do this. And so at that same time, on a parallel track, Regenesis was a recipient of the first state's voluntary cleanup grant program. And we were able to go in and clean up the textile mill site. It was a hazardous waste and petroleum waste that we were able to clean up there at that site. And this is what that looks like now. And at that time, we were going after all kinds of grants, but we wanted to make sure money stayed into the community. So we created a job training program to make sure that that $20 million Hope 6 grant that we were going after, that we were going to be able to utilize people in the community and empower them. So this class that you see up to the left, half of the class, after we finished and they did their asbestos abatement work, they went to the Pentagon with the company to do asbestos abatement work, and the other part went to Katrina. The 2 ladies in the picture, one got a couple of more certifications, and when we started building houses, she became a homeowner. And what that did in the public housing project was that folks saw that here's a woman with 3 kids never working, now she's a homeowner. So now, that hope, no one wakes up wanting to do bad. if you give somebody an opportunity, this is what can actually happen. And so this is where we were continually, training people to be ready for the jobs. And back to the mill village that you see there, our partnership with the Housing Authority in that MOU, they could get eminent domain authority. We went back to Senator Hollings and we were able to get a grant to take out the 29 houses there. And we went back in the HUD and got this HUD 202 senior housing project put in the place of those crack houses that you see here. And this $20 million Hope 6, we were able to win that grant and build the homes there, Section 8 and home ownership. And another training program with the Department of Labor, workforce investment in our community colleges. A lot of times when people go after these job training grants, you have to apply and wait for the year. You don't have to do that when you're looking at workforce investment, the Department of Labor, your community college. You can create a training module that could be incorporated for training for job training purposes. And this is what we did. And we were able to take folks out of the homeless shelter to do the foundation work on those homes there. And it was at this time when EPA created the Collaborative Problem Solving DVD to talk about the methodology of what we were starting to do and the partnerships that we had actually built for communities. And using that DVD that went out, about 9 months later, the Korean reporters and some representatives from the Institute of Social Conflict in Korea came to learn how we were actually doing what we did here in Spartanburg, transforming this community. And the dialogue discussion, they knew more about Spartanburg than our local elected officials. And there's that train you can see at the bottom picture on the track there at the chemical plant. Part of what we envisioned too was getting our new green recreational facility, and part of that MOU with the city, they were able to win working with the Department of Commerce, getting this new lead recreational facility. And then we partnered with the Carolina Panthers because that's another grant piece of funding that, a lot of your sports agencies, Carolina Panthers were the closest to us. So we applied for that and got funding to build the multi-purpose field. And then Marcus Lattimore and Access Health built the playground in the back of this facility. And then this is where our grocery store, to meet the need of the food desert that we had, because seniors in that area could not, it was taking them like $25 for round trip to go to the grocery store. And so we were able to bring this in, and during the construction of this is still where people that we train able to work there. Well, they didn't break into this place because there was an invested interest in this. There was ownership, real ownership of people invested in here. They told us nobody would service and go to the grocery store there. That grocery store ended up being the top grossing store for the next 36 months. And currently right now, we're looking for a new tenant to come in because Save-A-Lot went out of business in South Carolina and Georgia. So we're currently looking for a new tenant to actually come back into our facility there. Now today, what we're doing is we're building, the affordable homes. And I want to put a pin in it for 1 second, because when you talk about affordability and affordable homes and affordable housing, the affordability is not the bricks and sticks. It is the financing. And what we have seen is that people have taken advantage by, carving off and building little matchbox homes to where, 30, 40 years ago, you couldn't tell who worked downtown in a office building and who worked in a mill. Nowadays, when you say affordable housing, you can pinpoint what is subsidized. And like this house here, you don't know the difference in the financing and what the costs were. And we were able to use a radiant barrier to reduce the energy in the, as far as the attic temperature in the roof. We did this back then. And this house here, the couple that's there in the apartment, they were spending $300-400 a month in their utility bill. That summer, when it was 100 degrees every day, they didn't spend over $130 for their utility bill when you talk about real energy efficiency. And we have solar on some of the homes in that line as well. And so this is another picture here of the alternate access that we were able to get funding from Senator Hollings. And at the backdrop, you can see the Hope 6 scattered site development. And then we have more senior housing to the left that we were able to attract and get in. And this is where going down the pike now with education, we're able to, once I got elected in the General Assembly, we were able to partner with some folks in South Africa with our Title I school to broaden the horizon of the kids in the classrooms here. Our kids thought that they were dealing with giraffes and lions, and all of a sudden the kids in South Africa was like, look, our infrastructure is better than your infrastructure. And they were like, what is infrastructure? And so the kids here in South Africa, I was able to take 2 students, and this is once I got in the legislature, to take the students over and really open their horizon of outside of Spartanburg. And here's another shot where the students in high school were with the debate team at Girls High in South Africa. And one of the young girls in the picture, they were talking about ICAR, the Automotive International Business Park here in South Carolina. And the students on our side were talking about Survivor, how is Beyonce, in South Africa. It was more of the entertainment, and our teachers and professors were about to pull their hair out because it's like, you guys have got to be killing me. These kids in South Africa are talking about ICAR, and the only thing you're talking about is Survivor. And so one of the young ladies, one of our smart alecks, she told the kid who was being very smart and rude, he was like, I really like your attitude. And when I come there, I would like to hire you to work for me. And that really shut everything down when the sentiment was, over there, they're going to come here and take from us. Now, here's a landfill today that was capped, and after $11 million, and we got it designated as an opportunity zone now. And when I was in the legislature, was able to get a bill passed for renewable energy projects on NPL sites that we could give an incentive for developers to build renewable energy on sites like this. And in the Senate, Senator Pinckney, this was actually his last bill that he worked on and helped usher in the Senate side for me on this. And this is where we were looking to establish the solar farm, and President Clinton in 2016 got the commitment to action from him to actually convert the landfill into a solar farm. And then, Secretary Clinton during the 2016 election, actually in her speech with Al Gore in the background, talked about how Superfund sites and brownfields and environmental justice communities could merge and go from EJ to renewable energy. And so today, what we're trying to look at is creating this Vulnerable Communities Institute here in Spartanburg on that textile mill site, where it will be housed with our STEM school and the Institute itself, our Innovation Center. While I was in the legislature, Bo Welling, who is the designer for Tiger Woods, actually looked at the project and said that this is the perfect place to design a golf course. And I'm like, man, you're crazy. Golf? We're trying to clean this up. And he was like, look, I'm telling you, we can build a green, clean course here. And then that's when he introduced me to Tiger Woods as president from the foundation. And they said, you need to come up with a theme. And I'm like, what kind of a theme with contamination? And that's when I got introduced to Jimmy Moore from BMW, an engineer who had a STEM school there. And he had students from the Jesse Jackson townhomes that actually built this android. And this is the first human android built in South Carolina by students, African-American students, out of public housing, C students. And so that's where I was like, okay, we can create this and create this as Tiger Woods did in California with the CSI. It's like, this could be our renewable energy STEAM school to focus on wind, hydro, and solar, because Jimmy said this was his vision to get kids engaged and teaching them on the different renewable energy, concepts. So this is where we want to bring those students into Spartanburg. They built this with a 3D printer from GE, and it was amazing. It was amazing enough that President Obama in 2016 kicked off this clean energy tour in Spartanburg, unveiling the robot with the students, and they built a rover as well. This rover, the same rover like you see it's on Mars, these kids actually built one and the wind turbines that we were able to unveil. Now, here is where we want to uh, create this aquaponics for the reuse of the fertilizer plant. What was once a toxic agribusiness that is now cleaned up, we want to come back with this aquaponics facility, because the same way we're able to provide discount for prescription drugs, well, what we're seeing at the health centers, a lot of folks come in with the high A1Cs, diabetes. You could teach people about nutrition, but it's another thing to buy or the organics that are expensive. And one thing that I saw too is that gardens, I learned from EPA that they can take phytoremediation on landfills and suck out the metals in the soil. And then when I started thinking about the soils in the community, it's like, wait a minute, tomatoes, cucumbers are sucking these same metals like the phytoremediation, and then we turn around and ingest it. And this is where you look with the toxicologists that I talk to. It's like, this is what you see around the country, people that are eating poison food. So this is how and where we can create this aquaponics and be able to give the produce to our patients, as well as where we have one of the larger public housing concentrations here as an end user for our produce. And so this is the kind of the short version, I guess you say long version, of the collaborative problem solving method and elements that you see that EPA created and put out, which attracted the Koreans, folks from Taiwan, South Africa, Switzerland, Germany, and other communities that we've worked with to bring into Spartanburg to try to replicate this model. Because if this can be done in Spartanburg, where there's no expectation, no resources, a red Tea Party state, and I did mention when I got in the legislature working with Gilda Cobb Hunter, we were able to pass the first environmental justice bill in South Carolina. Now, if you look at that, we have a Republican-controlled House and Senate. They saw the economic impact and value, and the bill went without reference, and they passed that bill. I got other bills passed along as well from affordable housing. It was the first time we were able to start funding federally qualified health centers. And so this is something that, when you see it could be done anywhere. If it could be done in Spartanburg, this can be done anywhere. And this is why, our vision, opportunities don't happen. You got to create them. And this is why I fell in love with Kat and Tom during the campaign. People wanting to make a real difference, not looking at the show horses, people that are walking around telling you with their stories and the papers. Papers have not produced anything in these communities that are looking for change. People are looking for real change. And that's why, after getting out of the legislature and during this primary cycle, being able to get in and roll up the sleeves and try to help other communities is the passion that I have now to get out there. People like Mustafa Ali and others that are out there fighting around the country, trying to help folks turn the corner, these vulnerable communities. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia Purifoy, the former regional environmental justice coordinator there at Region 4 EPA in Atlanta for 45 years. And Cynthia was actually the first person to come in to Spartanburg to help us with this project. And we lost the substance of people like Cynthia at EPA, especially during this administration. Cynthia had a heart, kind of like you, Kat. She has that heart and want to see change. And so I'm going to turn this over to Cynthia at this time. And thank you for allowing me to share the Regenesis story.
Thank you, Harold, and thank you, Kat, and everyone who's been a part of this webinar today. Can you guys hear me? Can you hear me? Okay, now let me see if I can get my screen up here. I have to tell you guys, I have been a part of this project from the beginning, as Harold said. But sitting here today, yet again, I'm almost in tears for just having been a part of something that is so very, very special. Having been an EPA representative, but really being able to be there to help the community to see things transform, to work with other communities to make things happen. And it's just it still makes my heart full just to be a part of it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit today about why Regenesis is successful. And I think you heard it all from Harold, and I think it all really evolves around him in terms of being such a great community leader, so dedicated, really putting things together. But I'm just going to hit a couple of the highlights anyway. You know, very early on, we worked very hard to inform and empower the community. There was a lot of workshops. There were a lot of building trust amongst the community. As Harold said, all of the neighborhoods got together and empowered him, and that really made a lot. EPA came in along with the city and the county and the state, and we did a lot of workshops for the community so they would understand what they were about to go through and what the different programs were that were going to be a part of it. And I have to tell you, you know, the interaction with the government really was key, and especially as Harold said, the congressional folks. I can't tell you how many times I was called into meetings because Harold had made a call to somebody and he wasn't getting what he wanted. And so that really kept us moving along, because if you have a congressman or a senator who is very engaged in what is going on at the local level, you're going to hear about it, and your management is going to hear about it, and you're going to be making sure you're doing what you're supposed to. And that was very helpful to us in moving things along. You know, really having a community that spends time to really develop their own vision, you know, putting together a comprehensive plan, and also engaging the youth. That was something that was apparent very early on. What was needed for the youth? What were the things that needed to take place? And those things happened. And then the Rhodia, Solvay, Regenesis, EPA dialogue was so important because you had a community who had been empowered and had a chemical plant in their community, and they didn't want it there anymore. And so we really had to work hard to, you know, really build some trust with this company. They came in right away. They did air monitoring, soil sampling. They really spent time letting the community know what their process was, how things worked at the plant. They did beautification projects, just really a lot to really say we're going to be a part of this community. And they really supported the community in their vision, and really supported them financially on a lot of the funding that was brought in. Again, having a trusted and informed community leader. Harold spent a lot of time learning from other communities. He became a member of the NEJAC. He got funding from the Ford Foundation. All of those were really key because, you know, really, as he mentioned a few minutes ago about really learning ADR and not always having to put that hard hat on every time you were working with someone, really helped to build trust and get things done. And then I think the community really learned very early on how to work with other folks. And, you know, Harold was elected to the House of Representatives. Another person from the community was on the city council and actually became the mayor pro tem. So those things meant a lot too, because you had a voice at the table all the time on behalf of this community. The federal IWG pilot project was very, very much a winning effort for us at the government, because we really got to learn how to get in a community and how to make things happen. And we had representatives from several Washington, DC organizations who spent a lot of time coming to Spartanburg to make things happen. And of course, we mentioned earlier about there was an MOU that was put in place between the local governments, the Housing Authority, and Regenesis, and that really went a long way. So we just saw the collaborative problem solving model, and just want to make sure you know that grew out of the work in Spartanburg. So I want to talk about some of the other communities that we've worked with over the years and worked very closely with Regenesis. One that comes to mind, and I think that really gained from the partnership with Regenesis, is the group in Savannah, Georgia. This is a community that is surrounded by industry. They're sitting right there on the port. And they had a lot of concerns, and one of the major concerns was the health of the community. So many people were dying from cancer, asthma, kids, all kind of problems. So to have a partnership with Regenesis was key. They went to visit Savannah, went to visit Spartanburg, and it was just amazing what the community saw and what they decided to do as a result of it. Of course, they said, we want to do exactly what they've done in Spartanburg. Let's start it. So they really went back and started doing a lot of the same things. They did a visioning process. They really started working more closely with their industry. They put together a community business roundtable. They did a community gardening project. Um, they eventually started a dialogue with the Savannah Ports Authority. They negotiated a number of agreements that really brought about a lot of change for that community and helped them to build some of their priorities in place. They brought in an NIEHS jobs training program, and it helped them to get jobs at a lot of the facilities there, and also to understand a lot more about what was going on at some of those facilities. And then working with the city, they recently secured a Brownfields grant that is really going to help to assist the community with continuing to make their vision a success. And one of the local city council representatives that has always been there at the table with us over the years is now the mayor of Savannah. Also, Jacksonville, Florida was another really good effort. This is a community, when you look at the health of the city of Jacksonville, this community is located in Health Zone 1. It's the most impacted area in the city. A lot of elderly people, a lot of youth. Asthma was a big issue there, access to health care. One of the things the community always wanted to do was to have a community health center in the area. When we had exchange between the Regenesis Project and this group in Jacksonville, they really wanted to figure out how they could have Regenesis be their technical advisor as they move forward, working with Superfund and the city and others to make their dreams a reality. And the community is still challenged by a lot of change with the local support and with community leadership. Another one that I think is really key is our interactions with the folks in Birmingham. We had quite an issue with Birmingham. We had our emergency response and removal program in Birmingham for a very, very long time, digging up yards in a very blighted area. A lot of contamination on the ground there, a lot of impacts to the community, a lot of health impacts. You know, we even had to do a removal at an elementary school there to remove lead from the soil there. There became a real relationship between the Regenesis Project and the city of Birmingham. The initial representative from there really visited Spartanburg, and she really wanted to see her area become a Spartanburg Regenesis area. Unfortunately, she passed away, but her son really continued to move that forward. After several visits, they really sought to do a formal agreement. We continued to do capacity building, you know, really modeled directly after Regenesis. We also did an interagency working group where we actually had every regional administrator from our Region 4 office working with Regenesis and the city of Birmingham. And also did a community advisory group that helped to enhance the work with industry in the area. So I think the thing is for collaboration, it is really key for communities, for environmental justice communities. As Harold said, I was there from the beginning. I worked with so many communities, and I just think this is something we have to do. And I'm sitting here every day reading the paper and looking at what's happening with this fight that we're in now, and understanding why environmental justice communities are being impacted more than anyone else, because we're up against the wall already. So I am so glad that there are folks who are looking at doing more in these communities. They need it. They deserve it. And I think you have someone right here with Harold Mitchell who can really help to make a lot happen. So I really appreciate the time to talk to you guys today.
Thank you so much, Miss Cynthia. Thank you, Harold, and thank you, Kat. Thank you, Anasa, for laying out quite a bounty on the table. So we've got about 15 minutes left to have some dialogue and conversation. And the way that this is going to go is, if you've got a question or a reflection you want to share, you can put it in the Q&A or put it in the chat, and we'll read it and direct it towards the person you're hoping to engage. So thank you for listening to what's been shared, and would love to hear what questions you have. And I'll just get it started while you all are thinking about your questions. So, Harold, I'm just so astounded and struck, because as you said, this is a moment in which the country in many ways is very divided, and many of our communities are very divided. And the work that you did in Spartanburg and continue to do really was made possible by getting folks to work together who in a lot of situations haven't figured out how to do that. So, and you make it seem easy, but it's not. It's not easy. So, what's your secret? What's your secret?
I wouldn't say so much a secret as I would say the motivation was at the beginning. A lot of the folks in the community that told me to get away, there's nothing wrong, were some of the same people that I found later. And this is about, and I'll be honest with you, this is like over a dozen of the folks that worked at that facility that were telling me to leave it alone. Family members came back asking me to come back to the homes, and I went back, and those same folks were telling me things that during this investigation, unraveling, were beginning to share some, things that they buried, things that they had done at the site. And it's like, man, don't stop what you're doing. Please, keep going. And then I find out a week or a couple of days later, that person died. So when you go through that for 6 or 7 months, a half dozen people, it changes you, your motives change, and your whole perspective of wanting to help, it kicks into another notch and level itself. And that's the problem today. Leadership, people's motives, I think is key. But that's where, now because of this pandemic has brought us together, I wouldn't be here on this call today, and you wouldn't be here either if it were not for this pandemic. And we're hearing, listening to things that we haven't heard before. And I think at this time right now, because there's a equitable and just platform that a lot of the CEOs and large environmental organizations partner with the EJ leaders to create a platform to be on the same page. People like Kat that actually can make a difference are coming together to make this difference, to take back the White House. These 95 rules that have been rescinded by this administration, it's making things worse for these EJ communities and these Black and brown communities. I mean, it's only going to get worse if we don't roll up the sleeves and do better. And I failed to mention, Taj, that, one of our big things was that we did elect our vice chair of Regenesis to City Council. And once people began to see the power, the Constitution says we the people. And once we were not confused anymore as to who was in control, that's when, elected officials started paying attention. And until you're able to do that, mobilize and in positions that could look out for your interests, that's where you begin to make the change.
Thank you. I think one of the things that's really exciting about what you're doing is how comprehensive your approach was there, that you brought pieces together in a way that was really quite remarkable. There are a couple questions in the Q&A from folks who are interested in kind of the elements of cooperative economics that have been a part of our community for a long time. And Ms. Joyce Clark was reminded of a book on that topic, which we'll share with folks in the chat, which sort of has some of that history. And you seem to be carrying forward that history. And there was a question specifically about, or an offer of support to maybe get a cooperative grocery store to fill the vacancy you got there in that facility. So a bunch of the folks in the chair are involved in the efforts, the economic development efforts that are kind of rooted in that cooperative economic tradition. So curious kind of how much that's, you sort of talked a lot about the training and job training and the ways in which you're sort of helping move folks out of public housing. And sort of how have you thought about the elements of sort of community ownership and share as you've done the economic development there?
Okay. Wealth building, wealth in community, we knew started with, home ownership and being in control. Ownership was key. This is why, doing the cleanup and empowering, creating opportunities for building wealth, that generational wealth. I mean, we had instances where we've had people that we've trained through our certified counseling agency. Folks thought that they couldn't own homes. It was embedded in them that this is where I'm to live and die, was in public housing. We had a perfect credit score, had over $60-some thousand in his bank account, and went to a home. And for months, he would still call us asking for permission as if he was living in public. So, there's a lot that, people don't understand when you talk about social injustice and economic justice. There's a lot of educating, and there's a lot of things that we have to do to help teach and train folks about generational wealth.
So the next question comes from Miss Conda Mason of the Runway Project and Impact Hub, and who's now doing a project working with African American rice farmers around the South, and really related to a bunch of work that you do as well, Kat, around regenerative agriculture. And Conda's question is, have you sort of thought about opportunities to in addition to the aquaponics, to sort of take a more holistic approach to organic regenerative farming and all of the sort of carbon sequestration strategies built into that? And wondering if you and Kat, have had any conversations about some of the regenerative agriculture potential for this. And jump in, Kat, as well, if you've got things to offer on that.
Kat, I'll let you. Did you want me to go first? Okay, Kat,
Sure, go ahead.
Well, what I was going to say was that the reason we were looking at the aquaponics, hydroponics, was because all of the soils in that area, we had 2 Superfund sites, 4 brownfield sites. So these soils had the amount of lead that was in the soils. I mean, the fertilizer plant, they had toxic waste shipped from Georgia they couldn't get rid of it in Georgia, so they brought it to South Carolina, put it into the fertilizer, came in as a toxic waste and left out as a product. This is all in the community, so doing farming in the community was not even a question. We had to come up with, new ways to grow food, and one of the things I learned from Mustafa with Dr. Cap, looking at aquaponics, hydroponics. Now, there's other ways to do it, grow it. That's what we want to learn. And so looking at it, we looked at, solarizing, those facilities like I saw in Europe, the photovoltaic facilities. I mean, here's a chance, an opportunity to engage and look at some of the technologies that we can implement into the communities. And, I think this is a great time now too, now that we're from Congress, trying to communities, we need to look at what are the needs in the community. With climate change, a lot of the farms here, because of the droughts, because of the flooding, you're not going to, we did in the past. So we have to look at new ways of doing business.
And I would just add, the regenerative agriculture agenda can be served by multiple methodologies, including aquaponics for climate control in a time of extreme climate variability. But we store healthy soils and extracts and so on with a non-food crop, which I think would be really look into. And that practice of dumping heavy metals to fertilizer is nationwide. A woman publicized this in the Pacific Northwest. To her great peril, she was completely ostracized from society, but literally trucks pull up in the dead of night and dump the heavy metals into the fertilizer factory, and it comes out the other end. It goes right into our soils, creating food that is toxic and so on. So there's a holistic, I liked what you were saying about Harold's at once. You shoot the moon, you win every suit, when you can't solve a problem, you make it bigger, and it gets bigger as well. So I look forward to looking into more, Khanda, thank you very much, of the solutions over the long haul.
So the next question that's coming in from Marilyn Mackle, how the public housing transition, and the question is, did the shift for some residents from public housing into homeownership occur within the context of rebuilding public housing? Was that work done with PERS, with HUD in and out of the? Could you get HUD out of the picture? So some of the question, I think my sense is for some of the folks who's had challenging relationships with these processes, and Anasa will talk next time we all meet about some of this happening in Memphis related to how communities have been displaced with though. How did you all manage that, Harold, in terms of just work with the agencies and moving folks into home ownership and trying to deal with some of the displacement questions? Can you say a little more about that?
Yes, it was a major beginning, putting people in housing commission, public housing commission, and on decision makers, because you can't expect someone to have your interests and best interests at hand. And so this is where at the very beginning, creating our structure, putting people in charge that looked out for our best interests. But one of the things too is empowering our organization. There are things that, we did here in South Carolina. You could do all those, the kinds of designations that are out there for, a CHODO designation, the Housing Development Organization, 15% of funds have to go to designated CHODOs. And so when we were at CHODO, we were able to use those funds, public-private partnerships, to be able to merge and look at different streams of how you fund those things. I think having our housing counseling component was being able to housing counseling, financial literacy, post and pre-counseling. That's something that, in 2007, when we had the crash, just wanted to make sure that when they lend money, that people were going to be able to pay. And when we were actually doing the counseling with these folks, we saw a big turn of over 95% of folks that were counseled that way retain their homes. You weren't set up for failure. And so there's a lot of small things that you have to do. And that's where this whole thing of planning, you just can't come up and say, hey, I want to see, all these bells and whistles. There's a lot of planning that you do, training, teaching, and educating folks to actually become those homeowners. And this is what we were doing, building our pipeline. And as people begin to see that I can become built based upon the need, we didn't put somebody in something that they were in a third of their income on their mortgage.
With just a few minutes left before we close the first round of discussions here, I want to invite you, Kat, to just sort of share anything else you'd like to reflect on with the community here about sort of, why, for all the work that you do in the different communities that you've been supporting over the years, why you felt it was important to have folks know about this story and the work that Genesis have been doing. And as we sort of think about taking the lessons from this conversation into the next set of conversations, which are going to be hearing from leaders from other communities who are doing very parallel work in very similar ways, in some different ways, but just some different ways that folks are approaching some of these challenges. So
Sure.
Anything you want us with as we close this first round of conversation?
Well, thank you all for joining today. And I really hope you'll come back for the next 3 sessions, because we are crowdsourcing solution sets here. And so the more of you who can weigh in, the better. I think this goes from the personal to the powerful. If you listen to Harold's story, the personal aspects of it are very important. It gives us a deeper understanding of the set of challenges that he was facing with his personal health, with his community's well-being, and with the spread of these kinds of issues throughout other families and so on. Not to mention, it's gripping. I'm transfixed every time I hear Harold tell the story of, you know, and story is very important. And Anas is going to talk a lot about story next time we meet. And it's important because we have a national narrative that is quite false in many, many positions of power. People thinking that the reason that we have pollution is somehow accidental, and the reason that it's located in poor communities is also because poor communities chose to live there. I mean, crazy narratives like that are abundant in our national collective consciousness, and they need to change, because actually this is a story about sharing power. We have extreme concentrations of power right now, and it results in us imposing as a society inflictions upon communities that are lacking in power. When we have distributed power, everybody has enough of everything, everybody owns a little bit of everything, we do really well. And so how do we drive towards models that share and distribute power equitably throughout? And then we don't inflict bad things on people because they have enough power to resist it. So thank you very much for joining today. I am so lucky in the company that I keep. We will support this work until it's spread throughout the country and the narrative changes permanently. And I invite you to join us on this journey, because your views are super important, and we want to hear about the work that you're supporting as well. So thank you for joining with us today, and more to come.
Thank you all so much. And if you're looking for the information that's on the screen right now, has the details for the next conversation in the series. And that information is also included in the chat as well. And there were a few more questions that came in at the end of the conversation, and we'll pick those up in the next conversation. So, and the work that Harold is doing in this time is really to be a resource to many of you who are asking questions in the chat about similar problems that you're facing. So this is just the beginning of the exchange and the dialogue. So thank you all so much.